is literally when you have systems that are run by very wealthy and powerful people who have the ability to make and change laws, then over time you can construct a system that, is essentially a kleptocracy that steals money from the poor and the middle class and just hands it to the wealthy. That being so specifically constructed was not something I really had thought about. And I think that was the biggest takeaway for me about the story and its importance.
This is Phantom Hampton, stories from where the rest of us live. Phantom Hampton is a podcast about the 99% living in the 1% world of the Hamptons. This week's episode is called The Gory Details. It's my look at two groundbreaking films on this year's Hamptons Film Festival roster, The Panama Papers and To Dust. I interviewed Alex Winter, the director of The Panama Papers, which is having its world premiere at the Hamptons International Film Festival. His last film, The Deep Web, and his new film, The Trust Machine, are also about secrets and anonymity. This movie was co-produced by Laura Poitras, who made Risk and Citizen 4. The Panama Papers is a start-to-finish thriller about global money laundering. Like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden before him, the Panama Papers leaker is a whistleblower who aims to be our global conscience. The film starts when a person calling themselves John Doe offers access to documents from the Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca to two relatively unknown journalists. The digital documents reveal the identities of key players in the secret world of the law firm's wealthy clients.
Hey, how are you?
I'm okay. But I saw the film.
Yeah.
Well, how did you get involved in this great project?
I've made a couple of films that deal, the last film I made dealt with sort of an investigative topic and covered investigative journalists as well as other people trying to uncover what was going on with the Silk Road black market.
I watched it, The Deep Web. It was really great.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Kara. And then I made a couple of short films for Field of Vision, one of which was about a journalist, Barrett Brown, who was getting out of prison. I'm interested in stories about two things for me. One is I'm interested in stories about investigative journalists because I feel like they are really the unsung heroes of our immediate present, and not just Trump, but just in the way the world is working in general. And then also I felt that, I'm often film-wise drawn to stories that I don't feel have been given the public exposure or response or gravitas that they deserve. In the case of the Panama Papers, it's interesting because it certainly was all over the news, but it didn't stick, and it largely didn't stick because it's a bipartisan issue. Both sides of the political aisle are guilty, and I just think everyone in power, both in politics and corporations and just certain rich actors in general, just wanted this story to go away, did not want it to hold. So it was kind of given its moment and then quickly buried. So that made me interested in giving it a big, broad documentary, examination.
I didn't hear anybody mention Clinton's or Obama's, but I did hear people say that over 3,000 times Dear Donald's last name was in these documents. But that doesn't mean that they're not in there.
Well, it's not really that cut and dried. It's not really about presidents. It's really about entire structures of government and business. All of those structures are implicated. It's not necessarily a big name, sort of juicy headline as much as the systemic corruption that we're talking about is really perpetrated by everybody. It's not just perpetrated by those on the right. I mean, we discussed Trump specifically in the movie because the film was coming out during the Trump administration. And, there's a lot that's going on in terms of looking at his. It's very rare to have a president who was a businessman who was so heavily and blatantly involved in offshore.
Yeah. And still is.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of names on the left, yes, you will find Justin Trudeau, connection to major players within his administration and contacts in leaks involving offshore and this type of corruption. I mean, it's everywhere. It's Nike, it's Apple, it's every major corporation for the most part, most major government players. The government in Iceland was not a far right government that went down. And so it's really looking at, a systemic problem that can't just be easily labeled as a partisan problem. And those are thorny, and they tend to not get a lot of traction in the media.
How did you get 23 journalists to agree to talk to you on camera for this film?
They probably felt similarly to the way I did, which is that it's a story that they're very proud of, but also one that they felt could use more amplification. So I, like any film that I do, I needed to make my intentions very, very clear with them. But then they also have to trust me, because at the end of the day, it is our film, and we're going to tell sort of our perspective on the story, earning their trust.
Did you pick them because you had some former contact with them and they might trust you? Because what I'm getting at is they were very afraid before this was released. But are people still afraid about talking about this?
Yeah, some people are. Some people are more willing than others. I mean, Daphne Galicia was assassinated like right in the middle of while I was shooting. So that was well after the papers went to publication. I mean, almost, well over a year after they went to publication, year and a half. Yes, there are still dangers involved in these stories. The entire landscape is something that many, many people wish would just go away. And then the specificity of it is, threatening to a lot of different people who are implicated. For me, I approached those particular journalists because I knew that I couldn't possibly tell, the story involved roughly 400 journalists that were working, during the course of the paper story being put together, and over 700 on the story after publication. I couldn't make a movie that focused on that many people. It was impossible. So I made a targeted list of some of the people around the world that I knew were deeply embedded. It doesn't by any means mean that they were the most embedded. They were just the ones that I selected. And then it was very important to me to talk to Bastian and Frederick at the Süddeutsche Zeitung because they were the ones who got the leak in the first place. And it was very important for me to talk to the ICIJ, who basically oversaw the whole campaign in wrangling, these many hundreds of journalists.
That was very cool to learn about them and to learn about their mission. And, because of the way that news is changing, the internet is not bound by nationhood. So now these stories are so big that they really can't be handled safely or effectively by one news outlet.
No, they can't. And, and also in this era when journalists and the news are under siege, both, by nefarious actors that want to dismiss, what they're reporting or silence what they're reporting in the case of autocratic governments, and also because economically they're so overburdened. And a lot of these papers are closing. I mean, many of the papers or some of the papers that cover the story are now gone. It is a kind of a period of great threat for journalism on a number of fronts. And, it was also important to me to talk to Rita and Scott in Panama for, the simple reason that they were, in my mind, taking a great risk because they were reporting the story right in the seat of where everything had erupted.
Oh, my God. And she said she had friends that she was having dinner with, and they had no idea she was investigating them. That must have been really frightening for her.
Yeah, it's pretty harrowing. And they're still doing great reporting in Panama, right now. So it's not like they were chased out. They held their ground. So did the reporters in Russia under great threat. They held their ground and they're still reporting. These guys are doing heroic work right now. I mean, the Panama Papers is a vast trove of data that will be revealing new stories for years.
Most of the journalists you interviewed were asking themselves, how do we make this fresh? Every week there's a story about corruption and everybody's pretty jaded and used to it. How do we make people understand that this is personal? This money's being stolen from you, from your social services. It's just not that sexiest story, tax evasion, unless you're committing it. So
yeah, I mean that's where I think a movie is useful. Movies are very good at really concentrating, especially documentaries, on really concentrating on what can be very nuanced and complex or dismissible subjects and giving them sort of dramatic emphasis. That's the thing thematically that I really wanted to show, was that for me, people don't care that the rich lie and hide their money and do nefarious things because they've been propagandized. It isn't because it isn't a big deal. It's because it has been so heavily propagandized. Banks, lobbyists, politicians, media outlets are funded by huge organisms of this very corrupt system. So a lot of the news and the information that we get, both from our politicians and from our even large news organizations, can be skewed in their favor. And it was really important to show that this is a systemic problem and it's been propagandized. If you're thinking that it doesn't matter, that the lion's share of the money that we need for public services around the world is being stolen, then you've been propagandized to not care about that. Just like we've been propagandized over decades to not care about rampant sexual harassment, which is now coming out through the Me Too movement. It's not like those things were never bad. We had been propagandized to say, oh well, it doesn't happen as much as people say. It's not that big a deal.
Like the reason most, so many Americans don't use their vote. It's total defeatism. But one of the things I thought that the film, as you said, a documentary might be able to get people agitated more. I watched it like a thriller, and you started with the two guys from Süddeutsche Zeitung, getting the text message in the middle of the night. So I thought that it really did achieve what the sense of it being a cliffhanger, and it was really impossible to stop watching it once I started. Yeah, excellent.
Well, that was the idea, was to construct it like a political thriller, which is really what it was. And to try to put films are good at making things directly experiential. And I really wanted people to feel what it was like for these two, well-respected, but basically relatively unknown and underdog journalists who are handed the scoop of a lifetime. And what do they do with it? And how do they make sure that it's protected and gets out into the world properly?
Right. And that they made that choice to give it to the ICIJ is very clear too, which I loved. I loved that they took hammers to their iPhones and their Macs.
Yeah, that's crazy.
What was the most surprising thing you learned that you thought you knew going in, but you were like, oh my God?
I think it's what Luke Harding says. His epiphany was very similar to my epiphany. It was, as I was working on it, it really became kind of jaw-droppingly clear that this wasn't a case of thousands of documented and verifiable acts of criminality. It was revealing an entire system. It was revealing essentially how our economy works. It is income inequality is really a systemic issue that it's by design. It isn't by happenstance. And that was really staggering to me. It's literally, when you have systems that are run by very wealthy and powerful people who have the ability to make and change laws, then over time you can construct a system that, is essentially a kleptocracy that steals money from the poor and the middle class and just hands it to the wealthy. That being so specifically constructed was not something I really had thought about. And I think that was the biggest takeaway for me about the story and its importance.
I remember that I pulled that quote because, he said, oh, yeah, I thought this might be a little part of what was going on, but this is the economic system, he said. I found that very striking. So that came through. Well, near French Revolution levels of economic inequality. I forget the woman